Imagine a noblewoman, cloaked in velvet, her face hidden behind a perfumed veil, sneaking past the guard post of a cold stone keep under moonlight, risking scandal and disgrace for a whispered conversation with a man whose name could never be spoken in her family's halls. Not love, not romance. A calculated dance, half war, half performance, one misstep, and the game was lost. Welcome to the tangled, thorny world of medieval dating, where affection lived in shadows, honor was currency, and marriage often had as much to do with land ownership as it did with attraction. For the lords and ladies of Christendom, dating was less candlelit dinners and more clandestine poetry, political maneuvering, and sometimes even duels to the death. And for peasants, love was a gamble between survival, cattle ownership, and hoping your partner didn't get hauled off by the local lord for a war or a whim. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To truly understand what dating, if you can even call it that, was like in the medieval era, we must first bury our modern assumptions. The medieval mind saw love not as an individual right, but a force bound by class, creed, and command. Most people didn't choose who they loved. They navigated who they were permitted to. In 12th century France, a practice emerged that changed the game for the noble elite: courtly love. It was not marriage. In fact, it explicitly forbade it. The idea was simple. A knight pledged himself emotionally, sometimes sexually, to a noblewoman, often one married to another man. He would write poetry in her honor, risk his life in her name, and idealize her as the embodiment of unreachable perfection. This love was pure, chaste, and maddeningly unattainable. The famed Troubadours of Provence turned this devotion into an art form. Men like Guillaume IX of Aquitaine composed songs of longing, praising women they could never have, because the yearning was the point. Fulbert of Chartres once warned that too much emotional devotion outside marriage might unman a knight. Yet many did it anyway, describing their loves in rhymed verse that still survives today. But make no mistake, this wasn't simply romance. It was status. To be admired, to be the object of desire, was a mark of prestige. A woman who inspired such love gained social currency. A knight who suffered for love earned a kind of noble martyrdom. It was emotional theater played out in the courts and castles of Europe. But for those outside the walls of nobility, the story was far different and far more practical. A peasant's dating life was entwined with economics, religion, and survival. Most people lived in small villages, never venturing more than 5 miles from where they were born. Marriage was often arranged by parents, and love might bloom only after children were born. Still, there was space for flirtation at festivals, in taverns, on holy days. In England, the custom of bundling allowed courting couples to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, tied into sacks to prevent physical contact. It was a bizarre mix of trust and temptation, one that didn't always succeed in maintaining chastity. Church officials tried desperately to regulate sexual behavior. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 laid out strict rules about incestuous relationships, not just among family but anyone within 7 degrees of kinship. In small towns, that pretty much included everyone. To marry outside this restriction, you needed a dispensation from the Pope himself. Still, lust has always found a way. In the town records of York in 1380, a tanner's daughter named Alice was fined for lewd behavior with a baker's apprentice behind the churchyard. Her punishment? Public shaming, paraded through the market square with a garland of nettles on her head. But such behavior wasn't rare. Medieval towns were rife with affairs, secret pregnancies, and whispered rendezvous. One of the most curious customs occurred in parts of Germany and Scandinavia: maypole courting. On May Day, young men would plant a birch tree, decorated with ribbons and tokens, outside a girl's home. If she left it untouched, it meant she returned his feelings. If it was gone the next morning, a heartbreak. If her father removed it and replaced it with a log, that was a firm fatherly no. But let's revisit the upper crust, where love was a tool for diplomacy. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married King Henry II of England, their union brought vast swaths of France under English control. They had 8 children together, some of whom rebelled against their father in what could generously be called the world's most dysfunctional royal family reunion. Marriage among nobility was about power consolidation. Love was a luxury, Dowries, alliances, and bloodlines governed who married whom. And divorce? Forget it. The church controlled marriage, and unless you could prove consanguinity or impotence, you were stuck. Some got creative. One noblewoman in Italy tried to have her marriage annulled by claiming her husband was bewitched and could not consummate. The case went to a church court. It was rejected. The rare exceptions usually involved royalty. The scandalous annulment of King Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine set tongues wagging across Europe. She promptly married Henry of Anjou, soon to be Henry II of England, days after the annulment. This reshaped European politics for decades. And then there's the case of Abelard and Heloise. Abelard was a scholar, Heloise his student. Their love affair was fiery and dangerous. He was a respected philosopher, she a brilliant intellect in her own right. When her uncle discovered their secret affair, he had Abelard castrated. Heloise was sent to a convent. But they continued to write letters that burned with emotion, defiance, and philosophical debate. Their correspondence remains one of the most compelling and tragic testimonies to love in the medieval age. But medieval dating wasn't all tragedy and scheming. There were moments of joy, of laughter. Even at village dances, boys would slip girls tokens, ribbons, carved spoons, tiny flowers, and hope they'd wear them the next day. A girl wearing a boy's hat was considered a sign of acceptance, like a medieval version of wearing his Letterman jacket. And then there were the laws. Oh, the laws. In 14th century England, the statutes of laborers prohibited laborers from marrying without permission from their lords. This gave rise to secret unions and handfasting, a kind of informal marriage conducted without clergy. Some handfastings were for a year and a day, akin to trial marriages. If no child was born and both parties agreed, it could be broken. If a child came of it, well, the union was considered valid and you were in it for life. The church fought hard to suppress these traditions, but people clung to them. In Scotland, handfasting remained legal into the 16th century, and some historians believe it's the origin of the phrase, tying the knot. Let's not forget the impact of disease and death. The Black Death of the 14th century killed nearly half of Europe's population. With so many deaths, the marriage market exploded in urgency. Widowhood was common, so was remarriage. Records show women marrying 3, even 4 times in their lives, each time inheriting property or gaining social power. For some, widowhood brought unexpected freedom. Without a husband, a woman could run a business, own land, and make her own decisions. Some chose never to marry again. In cities like Venice or Paris, a new type of relationship emerged, the courtesan. These were educated, refined women who offered companionship to wealthy men. They were not wives, but neither were they common prostitutes. Courtesans read poetry, debated politics, and sometimes influenced policy from behind veils and bedchambers. Veronica Franco, a famous Venetian courtesan of the 16th century, wrote letters and poems that survive to this day, expressing the power, sorrow, and thrill of loving within constraints society didn't yet understand. So what was dating like in medieval times? It was treacherous, strategic, often heartbreaking. It was ruled by church and crown, tangled in superstition, and carried out beneath layers of expectation and secrecy. For some, love was a means to power. For others, it was an escape from grim reality. And for many, it was never truly theirs to pursue. But between the ink of forbidden letters, the whispered promises behind cloister doors, and the sudden passion of a glance across a market square, love did find a way. Even in a time of arranged unions, deadly plagues, and rigid hierarchy, people still wanted someone to hold, someone to dream with, and maybe, just maybe, someone to sneak past the guard post for. As the moon rose over the castles and fields of medieval Europe, hearts still stirred in the darkness, beating not just for land or legacy, but for that sweet, elusive madness we now call love. And isn't that, after all, what we're still chasing today? Now close your eyes, let the flicker of candlelight dance behind your lids, and imagine a world where love was forbidden, and all the more thrilling for it, where we left off, deep in the flickering candlelight of medieval longing. It's tempting to romanticize the passion, the poetry, the daring rendezvous behind chapel walls. But love in the Middle Ages was just as often a negotiation as it was a feeling. And in many cases, it was deadly serious business. Let's turn for a moment to the role of chaperones. In aristocratic households, young women were rarely, if ever, left alone with a man. Even a passing conversation with a suitor was supervised by an older relative or a trusted servant. The presence of a duenna or matron served to protect a young lady's virtue, or at least to ensure there were witnesses if anything went wrong. Yet human ingenuity is as eternal as desire. Love notes were smuggled inside baskets of bread. Messages were scratched onto window panes with rings. In one particularly daring case from 14th century Italy, a knight disguised himself as a washerwoman just to gain access to his beloved's household. When discovered, he was banished and nearly executed for attempted seduction. She was married off within the week to a much older man. The role of gifts in medieval courtship cannot be overstated. Tokens of affection were potent symbols. A single glove, a lock of hair, a delicately embroidered kerchief. Each carried significance and could serve as both a promise and a threat. A knight receiving a token before battle might interpret it as divine motivation, or a curse if he failed. If a woman returned a gift unopened, it was an unmistakable rejection. If she wore it in public, it was an invitation. But even these exchanges had legal implications. In parts of medieval Germany and France, accepting a gift from a suitor could be interpreted as a binding engagement. If she later spurned him, he could take her to court for breach of promise. In one recorded case, a man sued for the return of a silver ring and a set of embroidered linens after his would-be bride married another. The court sided with him. She had to return the gifts or pay a fine equal to their value. Let's not ignore the darker edges of this world. Love potions were real and widely used. Herbalists, wise women, and apothecaries sold concoctions that promised to ensnare the heart of a desired partner. Some included relatively harmless herbs like fennel or lavender. Others included mandrake root, belladonna, or even drops of blood. In some regions, it was believed that placing a potion-soaked cloth beneath a man's saddle could bind his heart to the woman who placed it there. But these potions often had deadly side effects, especially when mixed by amateurs. A single mistake in dosage could lead to hallucinations, madness, or death. That didn't stop desperate lovers or vengeful rivals from using them. Then there was chivalry, a form of public mockery aimed at mismatched or scandalous couples. If a young woman married an older man, or a widow took a lover considered beneath her station, villagers might assemble at night banging pots, rattling bones, and singing lewd songs outside their window. This cacophonous humiliation could go on for days. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a ritualized warning. Your love defies social norms. Fix it or live with the noise. And if you think Romeo and Juliet had it bad, consider the case of Enguerrand and Isabeau, two lovers from feuding noble families in 13th century Flanders. Their romance, conducted through messengers and occasional nighttime meetings at the edge of a forest, was discovered when a page boy betrayed them. Isabeau was locked in a convent. Enguerrand tried to rescue her but was caught scaling the wall and lost 3 fingers to a guard's blade. She was eventually married off to an elderly merchant. He died in battle 2 years later. Their letters, somehow preserved, read like a liturgy of despair. "You were my breath," he wrote, "and they have taken air from me." Now consider the church's role. Priests preached marital chastity, yes, even within marriage. Sex was seen as a necessity for procreation, not pleasure. Certain days were off-limits. Lent, Advent, feast days, Fridays, Wednesdays, Sundays, and before receiving communion. That left few approved days for a couple to consummate their marriage. But of course, most people simply ignored these rules in private. Still, the church's grip was strong. Adultery could lead to penance, public shaming, or worse. In some parts of Europe, a wife caught cheating could have her hair shaved and be marched through the streets. A man caught with another's wife might be whipped, or, if her husband was powerful, simply disappear. But adultery wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was survival. A merchant's wife might take a lover if her husband was away for months or years. A lonely noblewoman might find companionship with a squire, a bard, or even a priest. As with most of medieval life, what was forbidden was often common, and understood so long as discretion was observed. Now let's talk about spinsters, a term that originally referred to women who spun wool, often unmarried and self-sufficient. These women were viewed with suspicion. A woman without a man? In the eyes of many, she was either a witch, a nun, or someone with dangerous ideas. But some spinsters found freedom in their solitude. They built households, took in apprentices, even arranged marriages for others. Their lives were not devoid of affection, but their stories were rarely told, except in whispers. And what of same-sex relationships? The medieval world condemned them publicly but recorded them obsessively. Monks copied texts warning against unnatural affections, but those same texts describe in rich detail the love between two men or two women. In certain convents, deeply emotional attachments formed, called particular friendships. While some were innocent, others carried unmistakable romantic overtones. One letter from a nun to her dearest sister in Christ ends with the line, "My soul clings to yours. I wait for the day our hands may meet again in secret." Were they lovers, friends, or both? The line was often blurred, and history prefers it that way. Even kings were not immune to scandal. Edward II of England had an intensely close relationship with Piers Gaveston, a knight he elevated to peerage, showered with gifts, and called "brother of my soul." Chronicles of the time, especially those written by his political enemies, suggest the bond went beyond friendship. Gaveston's eventual execution by barons may have been as much about jealousy and perceived impropriety as about politics. Yet, despite all the barriers, the arranged matches, the rules and rituals, love survived, thrived. It took root in soil it was never meant to grow in. There are stories, quiet ones, buried in local records, of couples who married for love, defied their families, fled villages, and built new lives. A blacksmith's daughter and a runaway monk. A farm boy and the baker's apprentice. Their names rarely appear in chronicles, but their presence lingers in village traditions and family legends. And so, as you lie here listening, perhaps drifting toward sleep, know this: love in the medieval world was never simple. It was layered with danger, decorum, and duty. But under all the pomp and punishment, it pulsed with the same desperate human desire we still feel: to be seen, to be chosen, to be held. History may speak loudest of kings and wars and treaties, but listen closer, and you'll hear the quiet breathing of two lovers in a barn loft, risking everything for a kiss. You'll hear the rustle of a secret letter tucked beneath a bodice, the hush of footfalls in a garden where they are not supposed to be, and you'll know, even in an age of darkness, of plague and steel, the human heart still found a way to whisper. And if you listen long enough, it still does. And still we drift deeper, deeper into the lullaby of centuries, where candlelight fades into darkness, and the voices of the forgotten whisper just beneath the silence. For all the restrictions of medieval society, love persisted not just as a fleeting emotion, but as a force that reshaped lives, challenged laws, and left echoes in the most unexpected places. Even in stone, take the marginalia of illuminated manuscripts, the tiny, often bizarre drawings that monks and scribes tucked into the corners of holy texts. Between the solemn lines of scripture, there are scenes of lovers embracing, hearts pierced with arrows, even couples stealing kisses under grotesque vines. In the Book of Hours of Jean d'Avreux, there's a delicate sketch of a woman reaching out to touch the hand of a knight, their fingers almost brushing. It's not mentioned in the prayers, but someone thought it mattered enough to draw. These flourishes, hidden between psalms and litanies, are windows into unspoken lives, suggestions that even those cloistered in silence and obedience still thought of love, dreamed of it, perhaps longed for it in the cold hours before matins. And longing was everywhere. In the songs of the minstrels, love was a battlefield where hearts were armor and glances could wound. The songs themselves were riddles, half code, half confession. A woman might hear her name, or a hint of it, woven into the second verse of a traveling singer's ballad. Was it meant for her? Did anyone else notice? Or consider the votive offerings left in shrines? Ribbons tied to tree limbs, rings placed at the feet of saints, or small carved hearts pinned to chapel walls. These weren't for healing or fortune. They were prayers for love. Love lost. Love hoped for. Love that had no other place to go. Some survive to this day in dusty reliquaries, the handwriting still legible. Sancta Maria, bring him safe to me. Let his arms find me before winter returns. But winter, more often than not, came. Marriage customs in the Middle Ages were laced with legalities that could trap or liberate depending on one's wit and circumstances. The simple exchange of vows, asterisk asterisk, I take thee as mine, asterisk asterisk before witnesses was legally binding, even without a priest. This led to a multitude of so-called clandestine marriages, and to a nightmare for church courts who were left to sort out who was truly married and who merely pretended. Imagine the chaos. Lovers claiming they wed in a forest glade, with only the moon as their witness. Others denying such unions ever happened, to avoid responsibility or scandal. The courts asked, did you say the words? Did you intend them? Was there consent? Consent was the keystone, a revolutionary idea even then. For all its flaws, the medieval church insisted on mutual consent for a marriage to be valid. Not parental force, not dowries, two people saying yes, which made elopements more common than we might assume. One story, pulled from the court records of Rouen, tells of a merchant's daughter, Colette, who refused the man her father had chosen. She vanished one rainy morning with a young stonecutter named Allard. Weeks later, they reappeared married, faces smudged with soot, hands calloused from labor. Her father tried to annul the marriage. The church refused. They spoke the vows, the priest said. God heard them. Of course, not everyone had such fortune. For many women, love was entangled with fear. Fear of punishment, abandonment, dishonor. The term love child was not a quaint phrase, but a dangerous reality. Illegitimate children could be denied inheritance, mothers ostracized or sent to convents. And yet, medieval records are filled with such births, testimonies to passion stronger than prudence. In some cities, like London and Bruges, foundling hospitals arose to take in these children. Often anonymous, these infants were left at the doors in the dead of night, wrapped in swaddling with a token, a button, a ribbon, a note, meant to identify them if the mother ever returned. Some of those notes still survive, water-stained, scrawled in trembling hands. One simply says, his father is gone. Cannot feed him. His name is Tomas. Please God let him live. And even in the heart of this darkness, there were flickers of hope. There are records of widows who remarried for love, choosing partners beneath their station. Of knights who defied their lords and ran off with maidens meant for richer men. Of noblewomen who gave away their dowries just to escape loveless matches, choosing convent life with a sigh of relief rather than sorrow. But not all stories end in silence or secrecy. Some made their love legendary. Consider Tristan and Isolde, whose story swept through Europe in hundreds of versions. A knight and a princess, bound by a love potion, doomed to desire and destruction. Whether told in German, French, or Celtic tongues, the tale resonated for one reason. It spoke of a love that defied every boundary. Duty, honor, even death. They died apart, but the legends say that from their graves sprang two trees, whose branches grew together and could not be separated. Or the lays of Marie de France, filled with tales of secret love, shape-shifting knights, and women who turned into birds to escape cruel marriages. These were fantasies, but they were born of truths. They captured the hunger for love in a world that tried to bind it. And it's in that hunger, really, where the heartbeat of medieval dating lies. In the gaze that lingered too long at the market. In the fingers that brushed in the passing of bread. In the songs sung too softly for anyone else to hear. Love, in medieval times, was not just a game of alliances and dowries. It was not all chastity belts and stern sermons. It was human, messy, dangerous, transformative, and in the end, the world changed because of it. The very idea that marriage should be based on mutual affection gained strength through the centuries. By the late Middle Ages, love began to creep closer to the center of marriage rather than sitting outside it, haunting the hedgerows and moonlit towers. The seeds of romantic love, watered by poetry and pain, eventually grew into the ideals we still chase today. So now, as your breath slows and the night deepens around you, remember, behind every dusty marriage contract was a glance that meant more. Behind every rule forbidding love was a heart breaking it. And behind every cold castle wall, some soul, just like yours, was waiting, watching, wondering, will they come? Will they choose me? Will they risk everything? And in the quiet dark of the medieval world, more often than you'd think, they did. And in those moments, rare, fragile, flickering as candlelight, something stirred that not even the church, the crown, nor the cold stone of history could extinguish: choice. The choice to love, to risk, to rebel. We don't often hear about the letters smuggled by laundresses, the clay tokens buried under hearthstones, or the songs hummed between breaths during threshing season, but they were there. These were not epic tales recorded in gilded manuscripts. These were the romances of shepherds and millers, barmaids and scribes, silent revolutions waged in glances and stolen moments. And their legacy? It's you. Because when we trace the roots of our modern ideas of dating, of love for love's sake, we find not just Victorian novels or Hollywood scripts, but the very heartbeat of the Middle Ages. The yearning that slipped through cracks in convent walls, over castle parapets, across village greens. Nowhere is this yearning clearer than in the medieval practice of love confessionals. No, not the kind whispered to priests, but to objects. In parts of rural France and Italy, lovers would kneel before sacred relics, candles in hand, and confess their love aloud, not to God, but to the air, the night, to fate itself. They believed that naming the beloved aloud made the emotion real, binding. It was a sacred act, a magical one, and if your beloved died, whether by war, plague, childbirth, or honor killing, there were mourning rituals meant to preserve the love. Locks of hair braided into cord and worn beneath clothes. Names carved into the bark of pilgrimage trees. Tears mixed with ashes and poured into hollow stones left at crossroads. In a time where superstition ruled half the world, love became its own kind of magic. The magical realism of the medieval lover was no accident. People genuinely believed that heartbreak could kill, that longing could summon spirits, that a truly faithful heart could cross oceans by sheer will. It wasn't metaphor, it was belief, and sometimes that belief was all they had. Take the story of Catherine of Norwich, a weaver's daughter in the early 1400s who fell in love with a traveling musician. When he left town, promising to return by harvest, she waited and waited. The village mocked her. Winter came, then another. But every day, she wore the same blue ribbon he gave her. When questioned, she said simply, "He will come back, or I will find him beyond the veil." She died unmarried at 28. Her grave bore a single symbol, two interlocked hands carved into the stone. 100 years later, a merchant's son found a weathered diary in a roadside chapel in Devon, filled with songs and sketches. At the end, to Catherine who waits, "I will find you, somewhere, in some life." Coincidence? Perhaps, but love never needed proof to be real. And what about those who never loved at all, or chose not to? In medieval convents and monasteries, we find volumes of writing where monks and nuns describe a love that transcended the flesh. Love for God, for knowledge, for the idea of the divine. They wrote of joy, peace, even ecstasy. And yet, even in these sacred halls, stories of forbidden affection lingered. There's the case of Brother Stephanus, a Benedictine scribe who composed 42 love poems, not to a woman, but to the act of writing itself. The way the quill danced, the soft sigh of parchment, and in one, a line that scholars still debate. "My hand shakes not from age, but the thought of eyes once gazing back." Who were those eyes? We'll never know, but the poem remains. Just like the palm reader's stall in Prague, where for a few coins a woman would draw two hearts in ash, press your thumb into the center and whisper, "There is always another life. Perhaps this time you'll find them." It wasn't science, but it was something older, something true. And then there were the plague marriages. In the worst years of the Black Death, when death came by morning and left no one to bury the bodies, people still sought each other out. Entire generations were cut in half, and yet young couples chose to marry on Plague Eve, surrounded by mass graves and priests too exhausted to perform the rites. Why? Because even on the edge of extinction, they chose love. For a day, for an hour, for one kiss in a dying world. The 14th century chronicler Jean de Venette describes one such moment. They wed as the sky darkened with crows. They lay together in the chapel, unblessed, unshriven, but joyous. And in the morning they were both gone. No plague shall erase such love. No history book tells their names. But we remember them tonight, and that, perhaps, is what medieval love leaves us with. Not just the drama of nobility or the mechanics of arranged unions, but the defiant insistence that love matters, even when the world does not agree. That somewhere between the mandates of the church and the expectations of class, real hearts still beat, in silence, in rebellion, in longing. So as you lay here now, suspended in the still hush of night, perhaps drifting between dream and memory, consider this. The people who lived in those cold stone towers and straw-thatched cottages were not so different from us. They wanted to be chosen, to be understood, to be remembered, and when they could not have it in life, they etched their hopes into the world. Through poems, tokens, songs, and scandal, they dared to love, despite law, despite God, despite fate. And now, centuries later, their stories ripple into ours. That heartbeat you hear just beneath the quiet is theirs, and it never stopped.